welcome to the deep dive. So you've given us this stack of sources, articles, notes, research.
Quite a mix.
Yeah, and our job, as always, is to dive in, pull out the key stuff, maybe challenge some assumptions hiding in there.
And hopefully uncover some things you might have missed.
Exactly. Today, we've got, well, a lot. The latest in Ukraine and Russia, some really strategic questions there.
Mm-hmm. Big picture stuff.
Then a pretty sharp look at U.S. spending, the national debt. Some strong words used in the sources.
Definitely some provocative takes on the economy.
Then there's this really strange story, kind of disturbing actually, about a fungus and potential agro-terrorism.
Yeah, that one's unusual. And concerning.
And big tech making moves on power sources, which is interesting.
Tied into AI, mainly. Huge power needs.
Right. And finally, we'll get into political dynamics, how the media covers things, public perception, how it all gets shaped.
The spin, the narratives.
So the goal is simple, really. Help you cut through the noise, see the core dynamics based on what's in your sources. Let's get into it.
Sounds good. It's definitely a complex set of topics, moving from, global conflict right down to specific incidents and back out again.
Yeah, and we'll try to connect the dots where the sources do, show how these things might influence each other.
Exactly, how one thing impacts another.
Okay, so starting with that global conflict piece, Ukraine or Russia. The sources are pointing to a really significant development, a Ukrainian drone attack deep inside Russia.
Yeah, and one source, uses incredibly strong language, calling it Russia's Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, wow. And Russia is vowing a response.
A devastating response is the quote. The source details around $7 billion in damages.
$7 billion.
Yeah, and crucially, it hit bases housing nuclear bombers. Now, they weren't nuclear armed at the time, the source says.
But still, targeting the delivery systems.
Exactly. That's a clear escalation in Russia's eyes. And it seems to feed into this view in the source material about where Russia stands right now.
Right, because there was maybe this hope or idea that Putin might be looking for an off-ramp, willing to talk peace.
But the sources are really pushing back on that now, suggesting, maybe he has no real desire to end the war.
The economy's shifted.
Fully a wartime engine, the source argues. And maybe his territorial goals go beyond just pushing back against NATO.
So the public talk about peace. Just talk.
That's what the sources imply. Public statements, but zero actual moves towards de-escalation. One source kind of shrugs, saying, well, what do you expect from a former KGB guy? Posturing versus action.
Okay, but here's the really unsettling part you mentioned. This attack, it technically meets the criteria in Russia's own nuclear doctrine for using nuclear weapons.
According to the source, yes. It technically crosses a line that could, on paper, authorize their use.
That seems incredibly dangerous. Have they said they will use them?
No. The source is very clear on that. They haven't said they will, but they are pointing out, hey, this line you just crossed, that's in our doctrine, after, previously just sort of flirting with nuclear rhetoric.
So they're highlighting the line was crossed.
Right. The source's gut feeling. Nuclear escalation is still exceedingly low, for now. But that vow of a response matching the energy of the U.S. Pearl Harbor response, that's obviously worrying.
Okay, so if Russia does respond with that kind of energy, where does this potentially lead? What's the escalation ladder look like, according to the sources?
Well, the source maps out a few paths. Russia hits back hard. Maybe Europe really wakes up, sees the U.S. won't foot the bill forever, and starts seriously investing in its own military.
Getting some buddy cop juice, as the source puts it.
Yeah, that's the phrase. And cynically, the source notes Europe's own economic woes might even make a wartime economy look tempting to some leaders there.
Okay, so Europe steps up. What else?
Then maybe Ukraine hits back again, perhaps with another Operation Spiderweb type attack.
You mentioned that before. What is it?
It's tied to Ukraine's potential ace up the sleeve, the source mentions. Their claim is that Operation Spiderweb is heavily AI-driven.
AI-driven attacks.
Yeah, the idea is they supposedly pulled their human operatives out of Russia before this big drone strike, implying AI lets them do these long-range hits without needing people on the ground.
If that's true, that's a significant development.
It really is, a sign they think they're ahead in that specific tech race, as the source puts it. But back to the latter.
Right, the escalation.
If Ukraine hits again, you get this tit-for-tat cycle. That could pull Europe in deeper. Or eventually Russia does something that actually triggers the NATO treaty.
Article 5.
Article 5.
Yeah.
And that brings the U.S. in directly. So the source is watching Europe's moves, Ukraine's next actions, and just how escalatory Russia's response turns out to be.
It feels like Ukraine is taking a huge risk, though, attacking like this right before supposed peace negotiations were started.
Yeah, the source wrestles with that. What message does that send? Option 1, their initial thought, it's a message of strength. We're not weak. Give us leverage in talks. But as the source notes, that's ultra high risk.
And option 2.
Option 2, which the source leans towards. Maybe it's just YOLO, going all in. Perhaps they feel they can't rely on America long term, but they can count on Europe for major backing, funding, maybe even military involvement down the line.
And how do those peace talks go, by the way?
Over almost instantly, like an hour. Only agreed on a prisoner swap, exchange of bodies, about 12,000 total, the source said. No ceasefire, nothing substantive.
So back to the U.S., why isn't America more directly involved? The sources seem to point to a few things.
Yeah, the main view seems to be direct U.S. military action probably needs that NATO Article 5 trigger, or God forbid, a direct attack on the U.S. itself.
And politics?
Absolutely. The U.S. is just not unified on this politically. There's no public consensus for intervention, and the source points to someone like Trump, who's historically skeptical of NATO anyway, likely wanting to frame it as Europe's problem.
Unless something really big happens.
Yeah, unless Putin does something that crosses a major line, like maybe using a dirty bomb, and it's something that makes a leader like Trump feel personally disrespected or directly challenged. The source feels Trump knows you can't really pursue a major intervention without public unity.
Okay, but despite Ukraine holding on surprisingly well, the sources suggest there's still this deep-seated fear of Russia. Why is that? It's not just about their current army. Right?
No, not at all. The sources hit two main points: history and nukes. Historically trying to invade Russia.
Yeah.
Disaster. Think Napoleon, think Stalingrad in World War II.
Right.
Russia has shown this, frankly, chilling willingness to absorb immense casualties, to just keep throwing young men into the grinder, as the source puts it, to wear you down. They won't let you push deep into their country.
And the nukes.
That's the other part. The source uses this analogy. Fighting Russia conventionally is like boxing someone who has a rocket launcher tucked in their belt.
You're hoping they stick to boxing.
Exactly, but at any moment, they can change the game entirely. To the mushroom cloud game, because they have the world's largest nuclear arsenal.
So it's the history of endurance plus the existential threat.
Precisely, and that fear of the unknown. How would Putin react if truly cornered, especially if his values aren't, aligned with Western ones? As the source says bluntly, that nuclear option changes everything. Anyone who thinks otherwise, 75 trillion or not, just doesn't get it.
It also raises that risk the source mentions, Thucydides' trap.
Right. That historical danger zone when a rising power challenges an established one. Avoiding that kind of great power war is a constant underlying tension.
Okay, let's shift gears dramatically. U.S. economy, national debt. The sources have some pretty stark things to say here. One highlights Elon Musk reacting to that huge spending bill recently.
Yeah, calling it a disgusting abomination, pork-filled. The source notes even some Republicans, Trump allies, voted against it. Adds an estimated $5 trillion to the deficit over 10 years.
$5 trillion, wow.
And this is where the sources get into what one calls a law of economic physics, though they stress it's man-made, not natural.
Okay. What's the law?
The core idea is, well, pretty provocative. It's that the current monetary system basically requires deficit spending to keep functioning. Debt is the oxygen to the current economic fire.
Wait, requires it? We're always told debt is bad. How can the system need it?
Well, the source argues it's about how money is created, fractional reserve banking.
Mm-hmm.
The structure means you essentially can't pay off existing debt without printing more money.
Right.
And printing more money in the system equals inflation. So inflation isn't just a bug, it's a feature.
Right.
It's necessary for the system to keep creating the new debt it needs to function and grow.
So no matter who's in charge.
Inflation happens, the source argues, just maybe at different rates.
Yeah.
Because the underlying structure demands new debt.
What about balanced budgets? Like under Clinton, didn't we have a surplus? Doesn't that contradict this?
The source tackles that head on. They say, yeah, the government budget was tight then, but look at what Alan Greenspan at the Fed was doing. He made corporate credit super easy.
Ah, so the debt creation shifted.
Exactly. Corporate debt exploded while government debt was constrained. The source says the Fed can kind of steer where the debt creation happens, corporate, consumer, government. But the fundamental math they point to is, if you create, say, $1 trillion at 5% interest.
You owe an extra $50 billion.
Right. Where does that $50 billion come from? It has to come from newly created money, which shows up as inflation. And now, with the national debt over $36 trillion and interest rates sometimes over 5%, that's just an obscene amount of money needed each year.
It sounds incredibly complicated, maybe deliberately so.
That's definitely a point the source makes. They admit saying it all goes back to central banking might be an oversimplification, but they call it a productive simplification, closer to the truth than how most people understand it.
Do most people understand it?
The source doubts it. Cites studies saying maybe only 16–20% of Americans get how the Fed works, and the source is skeptical even of that number, says even experts get tripped up by the layers. Mentions a former Biden economic advisor supposedly caught unable to explain some basics on camera.
Okay, so if the system needs new debt and people don't fully get it, what does that mean for politicians? What are their incentives?
The source paints a pretty cynical picture, calls it a Machiavellian game. Job 1 is get power. Job 2 is keep power.
And the easiest way to do that?
Promise people free stuff.
Yeah.
Benefits, programs, tax cuts sometimes. So you have a system needing new debt colliding with politicians needing to promise free things.
Which means more spending.
Exactly. It creates this cycle. And entitlements, they become the third rail of politics. Once you give them, good luck taking them away without losing elections.
So the pork in those big bills,
Yeah.
it's not a bug, it's a feature.
That's the argument. Politicians need to bring home goodies for their district to show constituents they're delivering so they can get reelected. It's built into the incentive structure.
So it's the system's mechanics plus political survival instincts. Who actually pays for all this debt and inflation in the end?
The source is blunt. You can literally print until the end of time in this setup. The people who get punished implicitly are anyone holding or getting paid in dollars.
So Americans, mainly.
Yeah.
And anyone using dollars globally.
Right. The source compares it to a kind of slow-motion heist, creating value money, credit from nothing, charging interest on it, and the cost is inflation, which eats away at the value of the dollars people hold. It works because it's slow, it's complicated, and most people just don't have the time or, frankly, the background to track it all.
Given that systemic view, do the sources suggest any realistic way to actually cut spending or control it?
Well, they note some proposed cuts in this latest bill, things like tougher work requirements for Medicaid or S&P benefits like 80 hours a month.
Right.
But defense spending in the same bill went up $150 billion. So it's not exactly across-the-board austerity.
Does the source offer their own fix?
They do, hypothetically. If they had a magical pen, they say they'd make people earn their keep, maybe raise the retirement age, require able-bodied people to work for benefits, but
They immediately admit it's political suicide.
pretty much. Says they'd never run for office on that. It hits this core tension the source sees in America,
Which is?
this constant friction. We want compassion, we want to help people, provide handouts, but we also want fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, cuts. We struggle with holding both ideas.
And the source's take.
Is that we need to embrace that tension. Stop the division, be razor sharp to stay number one. They seem personally repulsed by the idea of taking America's advantages for granted.
And the fate of this big spending bill. The big, beautiful bill, as the source sarcastically calls it.
It's in the Senate now, changes are likely, but whether someone like Rand Paul, who wants like 6% cuts across everything, has enough support to force major reductions, the source seems uncertain.
Okay, shifting again. Some really disturbing events highlighted in the sources. An attack in Colorado.
Yeah, this past weekend, an event supporting Israeli hostages taken from Gaza. A man attacked the crowd, injured 8 people, including, tragically, a Holocaust survivor,
How did he attack them?
used a makeshift flamethrower, apparently, and threw some kind of incendiary device. The source notes he'd tried to get a gun before but was denied because of his background check.
Could have been much worse.
Much worse. The attacker was reportedly an Egyptian national. The source presumes an Islamist extremist motivation.
How do the sources try to understand the mindset behind something like that? Assuming the motivation, of course.
The source speculates the attacker might have genuinely seen Israel's actions in Gaza as a new Holocaust, a genocide that absolutely had to be stopped, but
But the act itself is condemned.
unequivocally, the source calls attacking random people at a peaceful march unadulterated evil, full stop, and offers this really important warning. Be careful you don't become the monster you're fighting.
Like the Superman-Batman principle. Don't kill so you don't become like the villains.
Exactly that. And the source ties this directly to what they see as a broader issue, a missing moral compass.
How so?
They link it to a perceived death of religion, or at least the decline of widely shared moral frameworks. Even if you're not religious, you need some compass, some sense of how things ought to be.
And religion historically provided that.
Often, yeah. Simply by saying, God said so. The source expresses appreciation for the Judeo-Christian ethic, specifically the Christian idea that every single life is sacred, divine, argues it fundamentally changed how we see human dignity, and feels that framework is missing in moments like this.
And the source thinks this kind of clash, represented by the attacker, is going to be more important going forward.
Yeah, they predict needing to research this dynamic more, seeing it as a key fault line in the coming years. Now, how this impacts the Israel-Palestine narrative is interesting.
Does it hurt the Palestinian cause? Showing extremism?
The source initially thought maybe, but then pivots. Their analysis suggests these attacks might actually help the Palestinian cause, paradoxically.
By drawing attention.
Exactly. It forces the world's attention back onto the conflict, onto Israel's actions in Gaza, what the source calls Israel going ham on Gaza. This could cause major international PR damage for Israel. So while the act is evil, it might perversely achieve a political goal by shifting global opinion.
That leads to that really provocative idea from the source. Does the terrorist win by manipulating perception?
Right. Could this ultimately be a win for Hamas strategically if they get the world to turn on Israel, focusing on civilian casualties or alleged war crimes? And could that encourage other groups like al-Qaeda if they see the Hamas strategy worked?
What is that strategy exactly as the source describes it?
It's conducting a horrific attack, then deliberately hiding among your own civilian population, basically using them as human shields. Because when your opponent retaliates and civilians inevitably get hurt, your opponent looks like the bad guy on the world stage. The source calls it a gnarly but potentially effective strategy in the information age.
It sounds like the source really struggles with this.
They do. Recounts talking early on, agreeing Israel had to respond to October 7th because the attack was designed that way. Vicious act, hide behind civilians, make the responder look like the villain.
But it got gray later.
Yeah. Acknowledges wondering if Israel's response went too far. They even draw a parallel, maybe controversially, to MLK's strategy in Selma. Getting beaten on TV generated crucial support. The idea of needing to get beat up really bad until the cops come to advance a cause, though they question if Gandhi used human shields.
So it's complex, therefore on both sides, as the source puts it.
Kind of. Find out if you launch October 7th against a military power, you'll get hammered. But also, find out if your response strategy involves actions that consistently make you look bad on national television, because public opinion can turn against you, and that might be your opponent's actual path to victory.
Heavy stuff. Okay, let's pivot again. China, tech, and a fungus. This story sounds wild.
It really is. 2 Chinese nationals caught smuggling a specific fungus into a lab in Michigan. A guy, Zhong Yonglu, allegedly flew it in. His girlfriend, Yaning Jane, worked at a lab, but one not cleared for these kinds of biohazards, apparently.
And this fungus, why is it such a big deal?
It's called Fusarium graminearum. Nasty stuff, according to the source. Destroys crops, wheat, corn, rice, already causes billions in losses globally each year.
Billions, wow.
But it also produces toxins. If you eat contaminated food, it causes vomiting, liver damage, so it hits crops and potentially harms people.
Which leads to the term.
Agroterrorism. The sources label it a potential weapon for that.
Agroterrorism.
Who's it?
Yeah, nightmare unlocked, as the source says. Had you heard much about that before?
Not really, the source admits, feels like a whole new threat vector. The reports mention the girlfriend's research was funded by China, and she's a Communist Party member.
What happened to them?
Boyfriend deported. She's facing serious federal charges like conspiracy, smuggling, visa fraud, lying to investigators. The U.S. attorney called the whole thing a major national security threat.
Does the source think it was definitely state-sponsored?
Yeah.
Like an act of aggression by the CCP?
They're cautious. Says it feels like aggression, but acknowledges it could be unclear. Was it directed by the CCP? Was it a rogue actor? Was it even just something incredibly stupid done for personal reasons, like the relationship? The source stresses the need for facts.
But they also make a really important clarification here, right? About not blaming an entire group.
Absolutely crucial point. The source is emphatic. Separate the actions of individuals, or the CCP, from Chinese people generally. Being Chinese does not make you the enemy. Same goes for Israel and Jewish people, they add. The source's stance is clear. People doing dirty shit can fuck right off, whoever they are. Focus on the bad actions, not group identity.
So while this fungus thing is disturbing, the hope is China remains just a rival. Competing hard, but not.
not dirtier than normal, as the source puts it. Espionage happens, bad stuff happens between nations. But they want all the facts before getting hysterical. Bioterrorism, though, that's a major threat, and this feels like a concerning shot across the bow, even if the full story isn't out. The source hopes for rivalry that pushes the U.S., not conflict. Avoid that Thucydides trap again.
Okay, sticking with tech and rivals. AI power consumption. This is huge now, right? And the sources show companies making big moves.
Massive moves. Meta, for instance. Not quite buying a nuclear plant, but signing a huge 20-year deal with Constellation Energy for nuclear power, starting 2027.
Why? Just for AI?
That's the stated reason. The power demands for training and running these huge AI models are just astronomical.
And others are doing similar things.
Yeah, the sources mentioned Microsoft bought an old nuclear facility site. Tesla has massive solar farms in Texas tied to their operations. The takeaway from the source is pretty stark. If you're serious about AI, power is the next giant bottleneck after getting enough computing chips. You have to solve power.
The source called this a failure of imagination. What do they mean?
Their failure of imagination. Like, they wouldn't have immediately thought tech company buys nuclear power. But seeing it happen, they realize it's actually really smart, maybe even necessary. They expect more companies will have to do this.
Is there a government role here?
Maybe. The source notes Trump talked about making it easier for companies to build data centers with their own power grids attached. Raises questions about whether deregulation could spur innovation in power generation specifically for tech needs.
And how does this tie back to China? The rivalry.
Energy production. The source describes data showing China is just wildly outproducing the U.S. in energy. Yes, they have 3 times the people, but the source emphasizes China's approach seems different.
How so?
They don't seem as constrained by green concerns in the same way, according to this view. They're playing to win the global tech and economic race, and that means building power capacity like crazy.
So the source contrasts 2 ways to save the planet.
Yeah. Innovate your way out of problems or hobble everyone else's growth. The argument is China chose innovation and building, while the West Europe, America, has maybe hobbled itself by becoming moralizing dipshits, as the source colorfully puts it, forgetting they're still in a global competition that requires building and innovating.
They even mentioned something called the Report from Iron Mountain.
Yeah, noting it might be satire, but pointing out how it describes using big threats, like climate change, to keep people paranoid and reliant on government. They contrast that with the CCP, which doesn't need public paranoia for control. China's plan, in this view, spin up power, dominate economically, take over the world. They'll figure out clean air later because they want to breathe too.
Okay, final section. Politics. Media manipulation. The sources dig into recent comments about President Biden's health, specifically from Jake Tapper.
Right, and Victor Davis Hanson's response to Tapper's book and comments. The core critique, as relayed by the source, is pretty sharp.
What is it?
That for 4 years, major media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, figures like Tapper himself allegedly downplayed concerns about Biden's cognitive state. And not just downplayed, but actively attacked people who did raise questions.
Like framing Laura Trump's comments as just berating a stutter. Or calling the Wall Street Journal report propaganda.
Exactly those examples. The accusation relayed by the source is that this was tantamount to the greatest cover-up regarding a president's health, pointing to things like reportedly missing standard tests like a PSA from Biden's medical records compared to Trump or Obama.
So the big question the source raises is, why speak out now?
And the answer, pulled from Hansen via the source, is about power dynamics in D.C. Media gravitates to power. Now that Biden's perceived power is waning, there's less risk, maybe even professional gain, in telling the truth they previously suppressed or ignored.
So it's seen as a calculation, not principle.
That's the interpretation presented. The source argues the alleged White House cover-up couldn't have worked without media outlets effectively conspiring their word to downplay issues and attack the critics. The source also sounds personally disheartened that no major Democrat challenged Biden in the primaries, felt it was an obvious shot to take, given the signs reported by people like Alex Thompson years ago, but suggests nobody had the guts.
And this ties into a broader point the sources make about how politics really works.
Yeah. The source argues this is just what works. Politics is about getting and keeping power the easiest way. Promise things. Which, as we discussed, feeds the spending cycle. Challenging the party's death grip, as they put it, is super risky.
So the advice is, wait for the right moment.
Pretty much. Don't take a shot that guarantees you get isolated. And right now, the source describes a climate where right and left just can't cooperate. Doing so makes you a traitor to your side.
Loyalty is everything.
Paramount. Mention regarding Trump, and also, citing Alex Thompson again, within the Biden family, push back, you get iced out. And the source says that's how systems get corrupted. People play the game, keep their heads down just to stay alive politically instead of challenging things.
This all feels deeply connected to manipulation and perception management.
Absolutely. The source uses the example of recent flaps-over gestures by Cory Booker or Elon Musk, states flatly neither was a Nazi salute, calls the focus absurd. But the point is how often we are being manipulated. Everything is position and spin.
Yeah.
Word choices are designed to control your perception.
Social media makes it worse.
Drives the source berserk, they say, how nakedly people are manipulated. Complex issues get boiled down to instant litmus tests, quick pick a team, no nuance, no critical thought, no looking at full context like the good people on both sides example. It's all just wildly non-productive.
So what's the antidote the source suggests? How do you fight back against manipulation?
One key piece of advice: always actively seek evidence that disconfirms your beliefs. Truth-seeking isn't about finding support for what you already think. It's a game of disconfirmation. Look for what challenges you.
We have definitely covered a massive amount of ground in this deep dive, from dangerous turns in Ukraine and the strategies behind them to the, frankly, mind-bending mechanics of the U.S. debt system.
Right, and those disturbing acts of violence, the potential for agroterrorism, which is a new one for many.
Yeah. Then the tech world literally buying nuclear power for AI and this whole layer of politics, media, and how perception gets shaped or maybe manipulated.
And the themes connecting it all seem to be, first, just the sheer complexity of these systems, geopolitical, economic, technological, often way more complex than they first appear.
And the difficulty of finding truth.
Yeah, the challenge of figuring out what's real in an age of constant spin. And these underlying tensions keep popping up. Cooperation versus competition globally, compassion versus responsibility at home, idealism versus, well, the often brutal realities of conflict and power.
So given how easily our perceptions can apparently be swayed by just, simple signals or gestures like the ones we talked about, here's something to maybe sit with. How can we really train ourselves to apply that critical thinking, to actively look for that disconfirming evidence when we're trying to navigate the much more complex, interconnected challenges of global conflict, economics, and political power that we've explored today?
Definitely something worth reflecting on as you process all this and, engage with the world out there.
That's it for this deep dive.